Welcome to Polk's America, a podcast produced by the James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. I'm your host, Thomas Samuel, the Education and Program Coordinator at the James K. Polk Home. On today's episode, I'll take a walk through our new exhibit, Crafted by Conscience, Material and Belief in Polk's America. We'll also hear from Candice Candeto, the curator at the Polk Home, and the person responsible for putting together the exhibit. Crafted by Conscience runs from April to September 2019.
My name is Candice Candeto, and I'm the curator at the Polk Home. So my duties largely revolve around the collection, so taking care of the objects in our collection and then using those to tell stories. So interpretation in the house, coming up with exhibits in Presidential Hall, which is what we'll talk about today. And then working with Thomas, our education coordinator, to make sure that our collections are able to be meaningful to people and effectively communicate and engage. I wanted this show to focus on two aspects. So the belief part is the focus on religion in Polk's America. Which was a really important part of social, cultural, even political structure in Polk's day. And then that's a really big topic, and I wanted to come at that specifically through the lens of making and craft, because a lot of the things that religious groups believed, especially in this period in sort of the middle of the 1800s, a lot of their worldview was expressed in the things that they were making for everyday use, and sometimes specifically to practice their religion or to communicate it to other people. So the idea of crafted by conscience is that these objects sort of embodied the religious beliefs and the worldviews of the people who made them.
So I'm entering Polk Presidential Hall, looking at Crafted by Conscience, the new exhibit, and at first I'm struck by this enormous quilt propped against the wall, a kind of star pattern, bright, vibrant colors. It was a gift to an abolitionist minister, William Moody Pratt. So we're talking 1847, abolitionists in Kentucky.
The rough time frame is about 1820 to 1850, which is kind of right in Polk's political career. And one of the main goals we have for Presidential Hall, our exhibition space, is to be able to provide some context for what was going on during this time frame that would have shaped James K. Polk's life and his experience and his political career. And this was a really important time for American religion. So the context here would be the Second Great Awakening, which is a term that most people probably have some familiarity with from school, but might not mean a whole lot to them. So this was just a period of really rapid religious growth and revival in America. It was something that sort of permeated every aspect of American culture and society in this time frame. So it started sort of in New York. A lot of people have heard of like the burned over district with some of these ministers like Charles Finney, who were preaching these great revivals that were really making a huge impact on American culture. This was sort of coming out of the earlier, maybe end of the 1700s time period when a lot of Americans had been really influenced by the Enlightenment, and they had a strong sort of deist influence where they kind of had more reliance on science and on reason and logic rather than a more emotional faith experience. And the Second Great Awakening was really a reaction against that. So it was really characterized by a more personal, a more like devotional experience with religion. And I think we really see that in experiences like the camp meeting, where there were these very emotional religious experiences that a lot of Americans were having, and that James K. Polk himself actually experienced.
I'm looking at a wall hanging here containing a depiction of sacred harp singing. It's actually the Sacred Harp Book, a collection of psalm and hymn tunes, odes and anthems. And the shape notes were a way to bring the common untrained person into worship through simplifying musical notation into a series of shapes and syllables. Fa, sol, la, mi, fa. Fa, and the rest of the congregation joins in, and from there, fa, sol, la, mi, fa, up and down like that. You would practice your song with a series of fa, sol, las, and then switch to the sacred words and sing the hymn all together. Ideally, you could be taught this in an afternoon or so and join in with the congregation. I believe one of the most striking pieces in the entire collection for the exhibit is an old-time camp meeting. It's a watercolor work done by J. Mays Burbank. There's countless figures weeping and wailing, very dramatic. On the anxious bench, a preacher with almost corpse-like face, arm raised in the air, shouting his message to the people below. Interesting details here. There's several people that look otherworldly. One figure in the middle, sitting on one of the benches, is clearly Mother Mary, and an infant. Looks like a fairly critical take on the camp meeting. Overly dramatic, chaotic, almost looks like a scene of mourning. The exhibit is a striking reproduction of a Millerite prophecy chart, a chronological chart of the visions of Daniel and John from 1843. And it's a detail of the calculations that William Miller and his followers used to decide the world was ending in 1844. Well, originally 1843. Obviously that didn't pan out, but the piece has these demonic beings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-headed dragons, a beast with the Pope's head impaled on a center horn, a 9-horned lion-looking demonic beast, the 4 horsemen depicted here. Now, the world didn't end in 1844, as you may know, but the Millerites, they went on to form the foundations of what would become the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That was established in 1863.
We have a really great group of objects for this show, actually, from 16 different museums, libraries, institutions across the country. So the main groups that we're focusing on are the Methodists and the Baptists, who were the ones really driving that camp meeting experience in America. Then a group called the Millerites, who are followers primarily of a man named William Miller, who had studied the scriptures and believed that the world was going to end, that Christ's return would take place between about 1843, 1844. Then we have the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a group often called the Mormons, who really got their start during this time period and actually had a really interesting relationship with James K. Polk and with American politics during Polk's presidency. We have a group called the Oneida Perfectionists, who were in New York and actually a utopian community, lived communally. Another communal group called the Shakers that a lot of people are more familiar with. The Shakers actually started earlier than our time period, but they saw their period of greatest conversions and their most active period during Polk's life, during our time frame here. You know, this is a big topic, and certainly any of these groups could have been the focus of their own exhibit. Even just one aspect of their belief could have been its own exhibit. But I think there is something really special about being able to see all of these together and to be able to put these objects in conversation with each other. So what does a dress look like in a utopian community of the Shakers versus in Oneida? You know, these are two very different beliefs, different worldviews, but they're taking place right at the same time. And I think being able to put those in communication with each other is really interesting and special. And we do have objects that are coming from as far away as Utah, upstate New York, in New England, right here in Kentucky and in Tennessee. And being able to have these all in one place, I think, is unique and does allow us to have some really interesting conversations about what was going on in American religion broadly, rather than just within one religious group.
So I'm looking at a panel above a male Shaker outfit and next to a female Shaker dress, and I'm kind of struck by the color, the stylishness of it all. And it says on the panel here, Shakers valued simplicity and perfection in things that they made and used, but their clothing choices weren't drab. Surviving Shaker clothing includes a range of bright colors and even at times personal touches of individuality. So though the Shakers were very organized, there still were flourishes of individuality. One of the more interesting factions represented in Crafted by Conscience is the Oneida Perfectionists. Most famous probably for the silverware that came out of their utopian community in the later years. But they have some ideas that we'd consider pretty out there even today in 2019. I'm struck by the costume in front of me. It's a female's. It's a long shirt covering a pair of trousers, so they were able to move and work alongside the men. There's an unfinished viola. Music was very important to the Oneida Perfectionists. It provided a bit of a problem. You're supposed to be communal and everyone equal, but greater musical ability requires practice. Practice is solitary, and jealousy and other things might creep in whenever you're competing musically like that. Also, I see there's a small printing of Slavery and Marriage, a dialogue from 1850 This is written by the founder of the original Oneida community. It likens marriage between a man and a woman to slavery and presents the concept of marriage as a dialogue between Judge North, Major South, and Mr. Free Church. And supposedly the three of them argue and settle on the fact that marriage is slavery, and therefore the Oneida perfectionists practice a kind of free love and communal marriage in which everyone belongs to everyone, and children are raised communally as well, not between a biological mother and father.
I was really excited to be able to bring in some of these Mormon objects from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because they really are not very often seen outside of Utah. So we have a bench from the tabernacle, the very first tabernacle that was established in Salt Lake City, which is grain painted. And I think this is a really fun story in American religion as it intersects with the idea of craft traditions, because unlike some of the other utopian communities and groups that were living sort of separate from the world, who wanted to be very plain and to reject mainstream consumer culture, the Mormons actually embraced the idea of fashion and style, and they thought that to make really beautiful furniture was actually something that would only help them win converts to their faith. And so, Brigham Young actually was a cabinet maker by trade, and he really encouraged his followers and followers of the church to make furniture as stylishly and as beautifully and as capably as they could, and that was actually a part of their worship, that it was just as a legitimate form of bringing honor to God to make a beautiful piece of furniture as it was to attend a church service. So I think that's a really interesting part of this story. And these early Mormon settlers, when they made it out to Utah, they actually didn't have access to the railroad until about 1868. So that was a long period of time that they wanted to create these beautiful and fashionable homes, but they didn't have access to those East Coast markets. And so they used a lot of pine, which was the wood that they had available, but they used grain painting as a way to imitate these more stylish, exotic hardwoods that allowed them to create that impression of fashionability, but in a very inventive way, working with the materials that were available to them. I wasn't able to really go into the theology of all of these groups. I really did focus on sort of the way that these religious worldviews played out and the things that they were able to make. But I'm sure that that visitors will have lots of questions about what did these people actually believe, and what does it mean that they held this particular religious belief. So I think that's something I definitely would encourage people to explore more after they see the show. There's also just, of course, a million different stories that I wasn't able to go into just for space or because of the objects that we had available. So certainly this show touches a little bit on the idea of race as it intersects with these stories of religion and making. So slavery certainly was a really important question in the American dialogue, and one that Polk himself was of course very intimately related to. And the experiences of attending a camp meeting and of participating in worship that's coming out of this sort of second Great Awakening tradition really did differ between whites, blacks, free and enslaved. And some really unique and beautiful traditions did come out of the enslaved community and their own unique experience with religion in this time period. And unfortunately, it's a story that's difficult to tell with objects because we don't always have a lot that survives. So we do have a few things in the show that touch on this story. I think there's a really particularly touching manuscript that was actually a document that was allowing a enslaved black woman named Mary to participate in a religious community. So the man who enslaved her actually wrote this note to be passed on to a minister to allow this woman to join a Baptist congregation. He said that she imagined herself a Christian, which I think gives you kind of an interesting glimpse into her own experience. But that's a story that I wish we could have delved into a little bit more in the show. There's also just the reality that the groups in this show all consider themselves Christian and come out of the Christian tradition. But there were, of course, many religious beliefs in America at this time that were not a part of the Christian tradition. And we did choose to focus on those that were coming out of the Second Great Awakening, these Christian faiths at this time for this show. But Judaism actually had a really important moment within this time period and within America. Reform Judaism sort of got its start and really started to flourish in during Polk's presidency, actually, in the United States. That's a story that we weren't able to focus on. So certainly it's a huge topic, and there's definitely a lot more that that we could have talked about. But I really do hope that this is sort of just a taste and a little bit of an exposure for people to sort of have this moment where they can understand just how much was going on in American religion during Polk's presidency, and then that they'll be able to kind of go explore further on their own.
Toward the back of the exhibit is a panel entitled Christian Slaveholder President with a picture of James K. Polk. There was a man, head of a group of abolitionists that appealed to James Polk in 1847 as a Christian in order for him to set free the slaves that he owned. And within the letter it's written, "You claim to be a Democrat and a Christian, yet you are a slaveholder. No greater sin can be committed against God, no more atrocious crime against man than this. Hear and obey God's voice. Undo the heavy burdens, break every yoke, and let the oppressed go free." It goes on to say Polk left no record of struggling to reconcile slavery and his religious beliefs. So as I stand here, just about to exit the museum, I find myself just contemplating the gravity of all that was happening in this kind of short period of time in American history. It really is apparent that a lot of the ways that we worship and practice religion have their roots in this Second Great Awakening. And the exhibit is a great reflection of kind of our modern religious conversations.
This story had even more relevance the more I delved into it than I was initially anticipating. So especially since we're talking about this story of American religion as it relates to James K. Polk, I think Polk had some really interesting thoughts and really helped solidify some of the ideas about religious freedom in America at a time when it would have been fairly easy, I think, given the spirit of revival happening, for him to kind of manipulate that cultural moment to shift the interpretation of things like the separation of church and state in a different direction. But for instance, particularly with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Polk was able to really put his foot down basically and say that despite their really growing unpopularity in America, despite even the violence that they were facing at times from people who really wanted this group gone, Polk, despite his personal beliefs, of not agreeing with this religious group at all, he really insisted that they would receive protection from the American government and that they would be allowed to openly practice their religion in the United States of America. And I think that's a story that's got a lot of resonance today, as religion remains kind of a divisive issue at times, and certainly today is something that we still find ourselves talking about as a country, how we can handle this idea of religious diversity and people with very different worldviews all being able to live together as one nation. And I think a lot of those ideas really were playing out in this middle of the 1800s time period.
Thank you for listening to Polk's America, a podcast produced by the James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. Crafted by Conscience runs this summer from April until September 2019.